Welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast.
Well, welcome to the Stephen Mansfield Podcast. It's great to have you with me here on this podcast where we look at our generation through the lens of faith and leadership, character, and history. I'm recording this on October 14th, exactly 3 weeks from tomorrow. The United States will begin, at least, if not actually, elect its next president. And I think this is a pretty significant election. I want to talk about some things that are absolutely true. There's a lot we don't know. There's a lot about this election that is unique in all of American history. But there are some statistics that absolutely will not change very much. They will determine what happens on Election Day. So I want you to know some of this electoral math. I want you to understand how it works in America, because it's different than most Americans think. When politicians win an election, they talk about a mandate. They talk as though the whole country has voted for them. And the reality is that a very small portion of Americans actually determine who is president of the United States. And that's why so much money is spent. That's why there's so much intensity. And that's why there is the focus that there often is. So let's dive in and talk about some of these electoral math issues. Number one, I want you to know that in 2020, 154 million people turned out for the presidential election. Now, because of the issues involved and the personalities involved, that was a pretty huge turnout. Sometimes it's as low as half that number that turn out to vote for president. But in 2020, 154 million people turned out for the presidential election and actually voted. That's important for us to know because there are 350 million people in this country. Obviously, some of them are too young to vote. Obviously, some are too infirm to vote. And obviously, many are not registered. You cannot vote in America unless you are registered. That is still the law, although some are trying to change it. So in the 2020 election, 154 million people voted, which, as you know, as you can tell, is only a third of the total number of citizens in the United States. In fact, the number of people registered to vote in 2020 was 168 million. So not even as many as could have voted did vote. In fact, 14 million who could have voted chose not to vote. So in a nation of 350 million, again, remember that some of those are children, etc. In a nation of 350 million, only 1/3 turned out for the election, and slightly more than 1/3 could have voted but chose not to. In fact, the number of registered voters is actually dropping. Right now, the number of registered voters is 162 million, down 6 million from 2020. So there's apathy that sets in, the apathy of the young, etc. They don't bother to vote. Other certain selections or portions of our nation demographically choose not to vote. But let's keep our eyes on that number. In 2020, 154 million people voted. Now, there's a stat that we can draw from that. Given how tight our elections are, given how almost evenly divided our nation is politically, we can expect that the president who is elected in 3 weeks from tomorrow will definitely receive approximately 75 million votes. Okay, let's keep that number in mind. 154 total voters, likely. We're just going by the 2020 election. Actually, the number of registered voters is decreasing, as I say, so it could be lower. But if you just divide that number in half, approximately 75 million people will determine who's going to be the next president. Keep in mind that 75 million people out of a total nation of approximately, and I'm rounding all these numbers off, approximately 350 million people. That's pretty stark. That's pretty stark. That means that when the president is elected this next time, 275 million Americans will not have voted for that person, either because they couldn't vote, too young, infirm, etc., or they didn't vote, or they voted for someone else. So this next president will be elected by 75 million people and not by the 275 million people who remain. Okay? So keep that number in mind. It's very important for us to remember that only about 75 million people will choose the next president, because that's all it takes to win, statistically, a presidential election in the United States. Now, I realize that some of you are saying, wait a minute, that's only if you go by the popular vote. I'll come to that in just a moment. Now, in that 75 million, there are certain segments, there are certain demographic segments that are overrepresented. What that means is that they vote in very high numbers and therefore have much more impact on our electoral process. These would be people between the ages of 45 to 65. These would be those 65 and older. This would be non-Hispanic white population. It would also be those with some college or an associate's degree, and those with a bachelor's degree or higher. So in other words, of the 75 million out of 350 million that will determine who the president is, in that number, there are certain segments, certain demographic segments that are very overrepresented. This is not any fault of theirs. This just means they're showing up and others aren't. So they will have a high impact, a great impact, a heavy impact on the election. Again, those are people from 45 to 64, and then again another segment from 65 and older, non-Hispanic white population, those with some college or an associate's degree, and those with a bachelor's degree or higher. Those folks have a huge amount to do, outsized really for their numbers, with who becomes president, because they show up. They're actually to be commended for that, but it's important for us to know that they play a major role, which is why politicians, knowing these statistics, slant their speeches the way they do, speak in the way that they do, go to the places that they do, talk to the folks that they do. This is what determines American elections. So now, this lands us, I think it's interesting that this is the truth, and we need to keep that number in mind. 75 million make the decision. And this brings us to the subject of the Electoral College that some of you were already wondering about, because we don't elect a president just on the basis of the popular vote. We have a thing called an Electoral College, and I am a strong supporter of the Electoral College. I think it's part of the genius of the Founding Fathers, because they recognized that urban centers, that cities would arise with large populations. And given the fact that not everybody voted in an election, given the fact that not everybody would be registered, given the fact that a relatively small portion of the population determines a president, it would become possible, they understood, and they actually discussed this fact, it would become possible for a candidate to win a handful of cities and thus win the election. And they believed that was inappropriate, that you didn't want to have a person just able to win certain population centers. That would slant the elections. That would make only the concerns of cities to be the main issues politicians paid attention to. And it would also mean that you would have elections or politics slanted leftward, right? People in urban centers tend to be a little less conservative, lean a little bit more left. And so it would be possible then for the more left-leaning party to have an advantage, just win certain cities and win the election. So let's just make up some examples. Again, I've said repeatedly that 75 million people approximately, give or take, will determine the next president. That's just statistically true, whoever wins. Well, consider, for example, that if you just take, let's just say, the 10 largest cities in America, and they would all be along the coasts for the most part, and they would not, for the most part, Chicago and Dallas and a few others aside, they would not be, for the most part, in the middle of America or in, of course, rural areas or in less populated states. It would be possible for a candidate to win the presidency having only won a handful of cities, right? Our largest cities tend to be in the 10, 12 million range. So technically, 8 cities of that size, a candidate would only have to win 8 cities, and they could win the entire country. And that would mean that a candidate could win by only addressing the concerns of people in urban centers, again, which have different problems than rural areas, industrial areas, and also tend to skew leftward in their politics. So a left-leaning candidate could simply take, I'll just use the phrase, a handful of cities, and we'd have to do the actual math to figure out exactly which cities, but it would only take no more than 10 cities to win the entire country. And that means that the person who wins the presidency would not have to be addressing the issues of farmers, would not have to be addressing the issues of the middle of America, would not have to be addressing the concerns of the Rust Belt or industrial belts, etc. You understand what I'm saying? There would be a handful of coastal cities this person would win, and of course, they could lean leftward, address the issues of urban centers only, and they would win the presidency. The founding fathers said that's not appropriate. We want farmers represented. We want people with certain ethnic mixes to be represented. We don't want just coastal, large cities to be the main concern. Because in a large city on the coast, you're going to have a racial mix that's going to be different from the middle of America. You're going to have economic concerns that are going to be different. You're going to have socioeconomic concerns, vastly different, etc. It just goes on and on and on. So there's a difference between what Oklahoma cares about and what New York City cares about. There's a difference between what Utah cares about and what LA cares about. And the founding fathers said the president should be addressing all those things, and thus the Electoral College, which required a candidate to get electoral votes from every state and to consider all the states. So Kamala Harris and Donald Trump have to talk to farmers, and they've got to talk to people who are industrial sectors, and they've got to talk to people who live in mountains, and they've got to talk to people, you know what I'm saying, who live in small communities across the country. That's why they have to speak to these crowds. That's why the candidates are in rural Pennsylvania, for example, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this really changes the electoral math that most of us carry in our heads. It's not going to be 350 million people in our country going to the polls and electing the next president. Nope, it's going to be 75 million. And thank God for the Electoral College, because it means the candidates have to not only appeal and gain 75 million votes, they've also got to appeal across the spectrum, across the states, across the geography, across the socioeconomic levels, across the racial levels, etc. It makes a healthier country. It means our presidents, our politicians have got to pay attention to the whole of the country. I think it's good. I think it's wise. I think it's brilliant. But I certainly understand, and here I'm going to be a little biting, I certainly understand why some left-leaning candidates would say, let's get rid of the Electoral College, because they do the math and they know that they could win the entire presidency by taking 10 coastal cities if it was only a popular vote, because a relatively small number of people determine the presidency. So this election is going to be tight. It may be one of the tightest, if not the tightest in American history. And it is going to be determined by a relatively small number of people. In fact, it could be determined by a relatively small number of people in rural districts. Keep all that in mind as you live out these last 3 weeks. Understand then how campaigns think. They realize they're going after basically 75 million people in the popular vote. They're trying to appeal across the country in the Electoral College, and they realize that outsized in their impact are people 45 and older, largely white, largely college educated. That's fascinating given the trends in our society. Now, let me tell you one final thing as I close. We've already had an election this tight. Now, of course, I'm talking about the election as though it's already happened, but I expect it to be almost this tight. In 1960, John F. Kennedy ran against former Vice President Richard Nixon, and it was so tight, I mean, unbelievably tight, that it came down to essentially an average of 2 votes per district. I mean, it's really stunning. President John F. Kennedy once said, it was in April 28, 1961, he made a speech in Chicago, and he said to a crowd this. He said, if all of you had voted the other way, he was talking to a room full of Democrats. He said, there's about 5,500 of you here tonight. I would not be president of the United States. Now, he was overstating, but he wasn't far off. Theodore White wrote a famous book called The Making of the President in 1960, and he wrote this. He said, this margin of popular vote is so thin as to be in all reality non-existent. If only 4,500 voters in Illinois and 28,000 voters in Texas changed their minds, the sum of their 32,000 votes would have moved both these states with their combined 51 electoral votes into the Nixon column, and Richard Nixon would have won the presidency of the United States. Actually, fewer than 12,000 people determined which man became the president. So we've already had an election in which a very small percentage determined the lean. And I think we're going to have another one now. Now, I have been giving a running update on who I would anticipate winning. And I will do that now here as we're 3 weeks away. At least as I record this, you'll get it a little later than 3 weeks. I'll have to tell you that Kamala Harris has had a stunning electoral season since Joe Biden stepped out of the race, and she took the lead. She has raised an historic $1 billion. She has done massive events. She has been endorsed by major celebrities. She has also been endorsed by a lot of Republicans who were in the Trump administration when he was president. It's been stunning and historic. Have I used those words enough? And I will tell you that even though she's done that, and even though I have to tell you that Donald Trump has stumbled again and again and rambled and been hateful and been negative and run a rather mediocre campaign, with one exception I'll tell you about in a minute, Harris and Trump are running, as they say in Texas, neck and neck. They are just about even. Every poll is in the margin of error. In other words, there's a certain percentage of error that you consider for any poll. And as long as the difference between two candidates in a poll is within that margin of error, you consider them to be in a dead heat or equal. And that's where it is. Although as I speak right now, again, Monday, October 14th, Trump is rising. Trump is gaining, which is stunning to me. And one of the main reasons he is, I'll have to tell you, is a real shocker. And that is, and this was the one thing I wanted to mention positively about the Trump campaign, is J.D. Vance. When J.D. Vance first got rolled out as vice president, other than the convention, it did not go well. He gave a good convention speech. I think he was a wise political choice. But for a few weeks there, he stumbled around. The campaign threw him like red meat before the press, kept Trump in reserve, and some of it didn't go well. But he has really risen. He is owning the press on the talk shows. He is articulate. There are a few questions that he stumbles around about because he did some things he shouldn't have done, by the way. He should not have discounted the count in the last election, and he stumbles every time he's asked about that question. Would you have validated the last election? Did Biden win? Did Trump actually win? Those kinds of issues continue to circulate, and he stumbles around when he answers that question because he shouldn't have answered it the way that he should be changing his answer. But nevertheless, he is articulate. He is sharp. He is tough. He is a new convert to Roman Catholicism, and he's articulate about his faith, and yet he's got a wife who's a light Hindu, in other words, a kind of a non-practicing Hindu. So he seems broad in that sense. Some Christians would be disturbed by that, of course, but I'm just saying that he's got this wonderful family. He's even got a cute dog. My point is that he has really risen. He's the most articulate thing out there for the campaign, and he has really helped turn this. He has really helped turn this, despite all the misstatements about Springfield and all the silly stuff that has been said and some of the foolishness of Donald Trump. J.D. Vance, if Trump wins this election, and right now he's rising, if Trump wins this election, a lot of the reason will be J.D. Vance. So this is where we are. This is the math. This is where things are going. Who's going to win? Well, time will tell. Right now, Trump's rising. Kamala Harris is wearing thin. She and Walz don't do well in interviews. Walz did not do well in the debate. Even the press is upset with them. And one of the things my final thought, one of the things that you can always know is that when Saturday Night Live is beating on a candidate and mocking them incessantly, they're in trouble if they're in a race. And Saturday Night Live has done some brilliant stuff mocking Kamala Harris. They've already beaten on Trump for years, but now they're giving him kind of a pass, or at least they're tired of him. And they have really done some hilarious skits mocking her excesses. And this is a sign. I would say election held tomorrow, Trump wins. But we got 3 weeks. There's lots of time for tomfoolery. There's lots of time for mistakes. And we don't know yet. But this is the status as of now.
Stephen Mansfield is a New York Times best-selling author, a popular global speaker, and senior fellow for public leadership at Palm Beach Atlantic University. His groundbreaking books on faith and society include The Faith of George W. Bush, The Search for God in Guinness, Mansfield's Book of Manly Men, and Lincoln's Battle with God. Learn more at stephenmansfield.tv.